What is more of a visual rivet than the teeth? Like a nail stuck through the heart. What is more near to what is called life is like for your teeth itself? You know, what is left after you're dead but your bones and your teeth? My work is a reflection of my life.
Bon, votre travail, vos peintures, vos toiles sont un reflet de votre vie. Qu'est-ce que c'est votre vie alors, d'après vous? Par exemple, qu'est-ce qui vous hallucine, qu'est-ce qui vous fait peur?
C'est pas une question de peur. Moi, j'ai peur. Qu'est-ce que j'ai peur? J'ai peur de quoi? J'ai peur de la violence, même que j'ai subi la violence souvent. J'ai perdu tous mes dents avec mes amis. Whether people like my work or hate it. One of the things I've noticed was they always talk about this violence of my work. But I don't think that my work is violent at all. You've only got to think about life.
Francis Bacon always denied that his work was anything more than a direct and highly personal depiction of reality.
No work that anybody can ever do has got the violence that life itself has got. I can only think that they don't think about life.
Never wanted to. What am I to do? I can't help it.
For the last 30 years of his life, Bacon worked in this small studio in his tiny London flat, and the majority of his pictures were painted here.
I was made that way. I can't help it. Men cluster to me like moths around a flame, and if their wings burn, I know I'm...
Despite the myths that have been built up around him, much of Bacon's life remains a mystery.
Oh, he's going to get a drink.
He revealed almost nothing about his family background, and very little is still known about his early life or his formative years as a painter.
Do you make any use of preliminary studies or sketches of any sort?
Yes, I do. I nearly always make a sketch.
Drawn or gouache or something?
I generally just make it out of with thin paint. But after that, chance and chance and what I call accident takes over. And if anything ever does work in my case, it works from that moment when consciously I don't know what I'm doing.
Turning chance to his advantage was also Bacon's guiding principle in his private life. He always avoided talking about his emotions, but he never disguised his sexuality. Despite his self-confessed promiscuity, his whole adult existence was built around a handful of deeply committed relationships with a series of very different men, each of whom coincided with a different decade in his life. In the 1980s, he fell in love with a handsome young Spaniard, a management consultant who lived in Madrid. John Edwards was his constant companion in the 1970s. Bacon made him his heir, and he inherited his entire estate. George Dyer, his lover in the 1960s, appears in more than 40 of his paintings. Peter Lacey was an ex-RAF pilot with whom he had a turbulent and often violent relationship throughout the 1950s. Eric Hall was a London alderman who left his wife and family to live with Bacon in the 1940s. Roy de Maistre was an Australian artist who recognized his talent and encouraged him to paint in the early 1930s.
I always remember my mother ringing me up when my sister's first child was born, and she said, "The child is beautiful. It's got 5 toes and 5 fingers." And I thought, well, what is this woman saying to me? When she said to me, "It's got 5 toes and 5 and all its fingers," and a thing like that. Obviously, it must be some latent fear that a monstrosity is going to be born.
I'm not sure. Frances had a lot in common with my mother because she didn't take much notice of his art or anything. I remember sometimes he brought home things that he'd drawn, and I don't know what my mother did with them, but she wasn't wildly interested in it. And they were always what used to be called 1920 ladies, you know, with the cloche hat and the cigarette holder and that sort of thing. There were always drawings like that. They were very nice. What happened to them, I don't know. But funny enough, I actually remember them.
Qu'est-ce qui vous touche surtout dans la vie qui passe dans vos toiles?
Qu'est-ce qui me touche?
Oui. Qu'est-ce que vous détestez? Qu'est-ce que vous aimez?
Ce qui me touche, c'est la beauté. Il n'y a que ça.
De quoi?
Surtout des hommes. Comme Michel-Ange. Pas comme Michel-Ange, mais j'aime la beauté masculine. Comment on dit masculin?
Oui, masculine. La beauté masculine.
Masculine.
I believe that he and my father did not get on. Frances didn't have any of the interests that he had. I don't think they had much in common. No, they didn't really have anything in common. I think my father was very severe in many ways, and he could get very bad temper, that I do know. But very seldom in front of us would we use to hear rows. He was, I suppose, a disciplinarian, but of course he was very Victorian, you know, in his outlook on life.
Bacon was born in Dublin in 1909 and was one of 5 children. His father was an ex-army captain called Eddie Bacon, who was a trainer of thoroughbred horses, and the family lived near the Curragh, the centre of horse racing in Ireland. Bacon's parents were both English and were part of the Anglo-Irish ruling class. The family lived in a series of houses in Ireland, and during Bacon's childhood they crisscrossed between Ireland and England, where his father was stationed during much of the First World War. At the time, Ireland was in the throes of a violent struggle for independence.
I think ours was the only house, in fact, that wasn't burnt down. I think a lot of the other houses were attacked and burnt, of presumably English or Protestant families. I suppose it was semi-religious, really. The IRA, I think, were very... Well, it was a wartime situation, really, wasn't it? And one always, you know, heard a series of awful stories of people being buried up to their neck in the sand and things like that. Even when we lived in South Africa, my mother would never... She never would sit with her back to a window at night. You know, an uncurtained window at night. I used to get quite annoyed with her when we always had to draw the curtains. My father was very keen on breeding red setters for shooting. Francis couldn't hunt because he had asthma. He was definitely allergic to horses.
Throughout his life, Bacon was asthmatic and was violently allergic to dogs and horses.
Some of my earliest memories were Francis sort of in bed struggling to breathe. You know, when they're struggling for breath, you know, they're very white and quite a lot of perspiration, really, because it is a struggle. Nobody knew about allergies in those days. And of course, he was terribly allergic, and I mean, there were riding habits all over the place and dogs. It was an impossible situation.
Vous savez, mon père et ma mère étaient dégoûtés avec moi.
Pourquoi?
Quand j'avais 16 ans, comme j'étais pédéraste. Alors, je suis...
Ils ont été dégoûtés.
Oui. Alors, mon père m'a offert à son ami, qui était enleveur.
Éleveur.
Enleveur des chevaux de course.
Et alors, vous avez...
Alors, il est devenu amoureux de moi. Il m'a emmené à Berlin. Alors, je suis allé à Berlin quand j'avais 17 ans. Alors, après Berlin, j'ai complètement déformé, vous savez. I went to Berlin. I wasn't in Berlin very long, but I did see Berlin about 1927-28, which was one of the, what's called the great decadent years, they say, of Berlin. And I went with somebody who had picked me up, whatever you like to say, and we went and stayed at the Adlon Hotel, which is the most wonderful hotel, because I always remember them wheeling the breakfast in the morning with these wonderful trolleys with enormous swans' necks coming out of the four corners. And then the nightlife of Berlin at that time, to go down the Kurfürstendamm and that kind of thing, was really very exciting in those times, because I'd never seen anything. From coming from a very puritanical country in a way, like Ireland, going to a city which at that time was wide open, was very exciting for me. I've been very influenced by the films of Buñuel, especially Chien Andalou, because I think that Buñuel had a remarkable precision of imagery. I can't say how they've directly affected me, but they certainly have affected my whole attitude to visual things and the acuteness of the visual image that you've got to make. I stayed for a short time in Paris, and it was about that time, at Rosenberg's, I saw an exhibition of Picasso. And I think at that moment I thought, well, I will try and paint too.
Bacon spent a year in France in 1927.
He's gone to Paris 4 or 5 times in the week, very often even in the weekend, because he makes some friends. He works drawing or to painting, and sometimes he comes back with drawing and paint with watercolors. But it was only in form of cubic, I remember.
Bacon stayed in Chantilly, a small town outside Paris. He lived with a French family called the Bocantins. Their daughter, Anne-Marie, was 5 years old at the time.
I remember there was a young man who was coming to live with us, and that young man was very nice and smiling to me. I saw him with child eyes, and I find him very nice, smiling, and like maybe like an angel for me, because he was so quiet, so with his round face and big, enormous eyes. I was about 5, and he was nearly 18. He learned with my mother French. She taught him French. Later, she told me that he was very clever, and he kept French very easily. And when they speak together, they were happy each other. And they talk about everything, I think. Painting, and especially going to Paris to visit the exhibition, because she knows everything about the painters.
In 1928, Bacon moved back to London. He rented a converted garage at 17 Queensberry Mews in Kensington and embarked on a career as a furniture designer. Quite why he diverted his interest from painting to designing, or how he managed to finance such a sophisticated undertaking, remains unknown. The style of his furniture suggests that he may have studied design in Paris, but no evidence of this has survived. The showroom that Bacon once hung with white rubber curtains is now a gym.
I had a small studio around the corner here in a mews in Queensberry Place, and I designed them there. But I never looked back on them with any pleasure myself. But you see, it was never any good, really, my designs, because they were so derivative. They were all derived from things that were being done in Italy, Germany, and France at that time.
What's that? Lamp's gone. Oh, I thought it was the IRA.
Once a painter leaves his native land, it's rather a mistake for him to draw too much on the subject matter that belongs to another place. After all, painting only becomes significant when it is to some extent separated from nationalism. I mean, it is the international thing that is the big thing in art, isn't it? Which is a common language to the whole of mankind.
Roy de Maistre was an Australian artist who had recently moved to London. He was 15 years older than Bacon.
Mr. Bacon. He was an artist friend of Roy's, as far as I was concerned. Uncle Roy and Mr. Bacon. I saw him there 2 or 3 times, I remember, as a child. I would have been about 10 at the time, I suppose. I always thought he was rather a strange little man, because one day when I was there, he came in and his lips were very red. And I thought, oh dear, you know, he sucked his paintbrush. I said to my aunt, you know, I think that Mr. Bacon had sucked his paintbrush, and a girl at school did that. And my aunt went, because she didn't approve of, you know, men with lots of makeup. But it's the lipstick that I particularly remember, and the cheruby face.
De Maistre shared his extensive knowledge of recent movements in art with Bacon. He painted lovingly detailed interiors of his design studio in Queensberry Mews and acquired several pieces of his furniture.
There was a rather uncomfortable sofa which was said to have been made by Bacon. It was rather ugly and clumpy and had curved, very solid ends and a solid back. There was a screen in the studio which was painted by Francis, and there was a rug, as I recall. He began his life as a carpenter, and his gift was obviously to work with his hands, because he started with the wood, and then he did the rug, and then he painted screens. I mean, the talent was all there. And when he lived with Roy, Roy said, well, you should paint. And so they started to paint together.
Under de Maistre's guidance, the untrained Bacon devoted himself entirely to painting and began to develop a style of his own. His early paintings may also have been influenced by the fact that Roy de Maistre was a practicing Roman Catholic. When he was 24, Bacon painted his first crucifixion. The year was 1933.
You yourself have no religious adherence or sympathy for religion. You have a very powerful revulsion against Christianity, I think.
You see, I was born in Ireland and brought up as a Protestant. And I was brought up a rabid Protestant. With no beliefs, of course. I think that most people who have religious beliefs are much more interesting than people who just live a drifting life. On the other hand, I always feel that living by a total falseness, as I think they are living, with their religious views, I can't help admiring them but despising them.
Roy and Bacon grew apart because Bacon took to a very different lifestyle to Roy's lifestyle. Roy became really quite religious and involved in very different things to the world Bacon chose, of, you know, drinking in Soho clubs all day and things like that, and rather mixing with the underworld, and that wouldn't have been Roy's form at all.
Et qu'est-ce que vous feriez d'autre si vous ne faisiez pas de peinture?
Je sais pas. Je serais
peut-être
criminel. Je sais pas, je ferais...
Mais vous feriez quelque chose.
I would be... non, je ferais... Moi, je pouvais voler ou quelque chose comme ça.
Oui.
Quoi faire? Quoi faire?
Avant de faire la peinture, qu'est-ce que vous faisiez?
Nada.
Very occasional sales of his paintings did not provide Bacon with a living. He later admitted that he made money from petty thievery and prostitution. He is said to have placed advertisements in the Times offering his services as a gentleman's companion, and for a while he was a personal manservant. One of his temporary jobs was on the telephone exchange of a gentleman's club called the Bath Club, where he met a wealthy London businessman called Eric Hall. Hall was 20 years older and was a prominent establishment figure. He was a veteran of the First World War, a director of Peter Jones, a justice of the peace, and a Conservative member of the London County Council. He was also married and had 2 children. But none of this prevented him from embarking on a relationship with Bacon, which was to last until the 1950s.
For many years, you know, I really did practically nothing. I had small jobs, and it really wasn't until during the last World War that I really started to try and paint again. I was turned down in the last war because I was an asthmatic. And then I started to work much more regularly and seriously, because I drifted. As my mother gave me £3 a week, which you could exist on, then I had just drifted. I used to like to drift round from bough to bough. I want to enjoy myself. When you're young, you want to enjoy yourself.
Eric Hall had supported Bacon throughout this period and had done what he could to promote the few pictures he did manage to paint. At the height of the Blitz, he installed Bacon in a cottage near Petersfield in Hampshire so that he could continue to paint. Bacon produced a number of pictures whilst living at the lodge, all of which he later abandoned or destroyed. Only a few photographs remain. Almost nothing that Bacon painted during this time survives. He was notorious throughout his life for destroying paintings that didn't satisfy him.
I never think about painting. I never look at a painting hardly. If I go into the National Gallery and I look at one of the great Rembrandts or one of the great paintings that excite me there, it's not so much the painting that excites me, but the painting unlocks all kinds of valves of sensation within me, which returns me to life more violently.
muchas veces cuando quería hacer una especie de declaración artístico, eligió hacer un tríptico. Un tríptico, claro, es esta forma en tres cuadros relacionados, que también es muy típico del Renacimiento o de la pintura medieval, y en estas épocas, pues, un tríptico era normalmente en el centro un crucifijo o la Virgen con el niño y en cada lado, pues, un santo, una santa. Y Bacon en este caso le da un nombre medio religioso, pseudo religioso, a ese tríptico, que intitulaba Bocetos para figuras debajo de un crucifijo. Pero aquí, ¿dónde está el crucifijo? ¿Dónde está Jesús en la cruz? No figura.
Eric Hall remained Bacon's main benefactor. His triptych went largely unremarked in a group exhibition in a small London gallery in 1945. And even though he had now found his distinctive voice as a painter, only 4 other paintings survived from the next 3 years. An enigmatic portrait of Hall himself, minus his head. 2 versions of the same subject which he called Figure Study, and 1 Bacon simply entitled Painting, which incorporated many of the images that were to recur in his later work. In 1947, Bacon met a dealer called Erica Browson, who took 2 years to find a buyer. The Museum of Modern Art in New York paid just £240.
After the triptych of 1945, you started to paint in a more directly figurative way.
Well, one of the pictures I did in 1946, which was a thing that's in the Museum of Modern Art.
The butcher shop picture.
Yes, it came to me as an accident. I was attempting to make a bird alighting on a field, and it may have been bound up in some way with the 3 forms that had gone before, but suddenly the lines that I had drawn suggested something totally different, and out of this suggestion arose this picture. I had no intention to do this picture. I never thought of it in that way. It was like one continuous accident mounting on top of another.
Union Castle Line, SS Kenya Castle. This is part of a street letter from Francis aboard a ship to Peter and me. I don't know the date, but let me read a bit to you. At our table there's an old boy, Queer, who has a physical culture school in Nairobi, and a very nice woman who is the wife of a gold mining technician. Also a young man and his wife going to a bank in Uganda. I have got off with him. Isn't it strange? Especially as he says he can't stand homos. I don't know what he thinks I am. The fishnets are a terrific success. I've never enjoyed a journey so much. Only wish you were here. All my fondest love to you and Peter. Isn't that nice?
Writing to his friend, Paul Dankwa, Bacon was on his way to visit his mother and 2 sisters who had moved to South Africa after the war.
We went down to meet him, and we came back quite a long way around towards the Kruger National Park to the farm where my mother was. I don't think we saw lion or leopard possibly, but certainly game, you know, other game, big other game and so on. On the farm, he would have seen baboons and all that sort of thing, because, I mean, we had all that kind of thing on the farm. Yeah, we did, and we shot for the pot there. There was lots of game in those days. You know, we used to shoot buck to make biltong. We used to feed the the pickers and the packers and that sort of thing, and used to get meat for them. We had a sort of big stoop on the back of the house, and that's where there was a table and the meat was cut up. So he would have seen all that, and he was absolutely fascinated with the colour. Because you see, the carcass is hanging for you to cut off the rostang and all that sort of thing off the carcass. He was taking in colour all the time. It was amazing. You know, he'd sort of show up colour that perhaps we didn't even see.
Were your family always aware of his homosexuality?
You know, my mother never mentioned it, not once. Whether she knew or not, I don't know. She often would say, "Oh, Mother, I wish he'd marry." But the last in the line of the Bacons. So I really don't know what she knew. And she certainly never spoke to me about it. My husband told me. It never occurred to me because it was never talked about. You know, they never talked about sex or anything, never mentioned. I really genuinely did not know.
I was dancing with my darling to the Tennessee waltz when an old friend I happened to see. I introduced her to my loved one, and while they were dancing, my friend stole my sweetheart from me.
Back in England, Bacon had left London to live in a cottage in the heart of rural Berkshire with his new lover, an ex-RAF pilot called Peter Lacey, who came from a wealthy middle-class background.
Francis says he was very sadistic, Peter Lacey.
He had a reputation for so being, and that may well have been part of his association with Francis, because Francis himself was aware of the joys of pain and suffering. That may indeed have been what pulled them closer together, you know.
Lacey was a sexual sadist who fantasized about humiliating Bacon and making him live on straw. And Bacon was a masochist who enjoyed being beaten by his lover. For several years, they indulged in this extreme sexual behavior with dangerous abandon. Bacon said he was physically obsessed by Peter Lacey, but that being in love with him was like having some dreadful disease. The relationship was fueled by alcohol and marred by Lacey's habitual rages. When his behavior became increasingly violent and destructive, Bacon decided to leave him and find a place where he could paint. He moved back to London to live with his friends Paul Danquah and Peter Pollock.
One of our rooms in our Battersea flat was quite small. In fact, it became Francis's bedroom, because he had, on the front of the house overlooking the park, he had a studio which is quite large and very untidy. Had an effect on our lives.
How do you mean?
Well, the way he lived was extraordinary, you know. Tended to have boyfriends who were bad news. Once or twice he came home to us in Battersea with an unknown friend, a young friend. He courted danger in sex, and he was aware of the pleasure of pain and was conscious of the excitement of extremes, whether being the punished or the punisher.
Peter Lacey went to live in Tangier, in Morocco. Bacon and Paul Danquah also became regular visitors, and Danquah eventually moved there.
Did he come here a lot to Tangier?
Yes, quite a lot. And at one stage took a flat and lived here. Tangier was considered a safe naughty haven outside of Europe. Not free in the political sense, but in the sexual sense and general behaviour. Francis' connection of coming here was to do with Peter Lacey. I think Peter Lacey had been coming here before Francis.
Bacon always used to say that Lacey was the one great love of his life, and he spent long stretches of time in his company whenever he stayed in Tangier. He also painted there.
I think I was satisfied with what I did. How can you be satisfied? Because everything escapes you. You know that perfectly well. You know, even if you're in love with somebody, everything escapes you. You would want to be nearer that person. How can you cut your flesh open and join it with the other person? It's an impossibility to do. So it is with art. It is almost like a long affair with objects and images and sensations and what you can call the passions. It's very much like that. You may love somebody very much, but how near can you get them? You're still always, unfortunately, sort of strangers.
Finally, Bacon stayed on in London, and Peter Lacey settled permanently in Tangier. He started to drink more heavily and became a piano player in a local bar.
I'm very influenced by the atmosphere of a room, you know? And I just knew from the very moment that I came here that I would be able to work here.
In 1961, when he was 52, Bacon moved from Battersea to a rented first-floor flat at 7 Rees Mews in South Kensington. During the 50s, he had worked only intermittently. With a studio of his own for the first time in over a decade, he entered a highly productive period.
What is the difference in the attitude when you start on a crucifixion?
Well, you're working then about your own feelings and sensations, really. It's, you might say, it's almost nearer to a self-portrait. That you are working on all sorts of very private feelings about behavior and about the way life is.
And the crucifixion is the armature for expressing it?
It is, yes. I know for religious people, for Christians, the crucifixion has a totally different significance. But as a non-believer, it has just an act of man's behavior, way of behavior to another.
As a self-taught artist, Bacon had conscientiously absorbed the work of the old masters, especially Rembrandt and Velázquez, the great Spanish painter whose portrait of Pope Innocent X had inspired his famous series of screaming popes. During the 50s, as he became more confident, he started to introduce his own life more and more into his work. Bacon was always attracted by conventional-looking and often heterosexual men with whom he had anonymous sexual encounters. Man in Blue is a series of 7 portraits of an unknown man he'd met in a hotel in Henley.
I've used Muybridge, for instance, very often. It's a very interesting work, and the images were tremendously suggestive to me of ways I could use the human body.
Bacon based many of his paintings on photographs taken by the Victorian photographer Edward Muybridge for his revolutionary study of the human figure and animals in motion.
I'm influenced by anything. I can be influenced by a news photograph or some photograph that I find in any kind of magazine as much as I can be influenced by Velázquez. Doesn't really much matter. For some reason, certain things bring up these images for you. And this was a photograph of Hitler when he and the rest of the Nazi leaders of that time were interviewing Antonescu. It's a photograph that's always I found very, very strange and mysterious. This is one of Marilyn Monroe. I've always liked the positioning of it very much. And this is the liberation of Paris. And this is one from a book of the gestures of chimpanzees. I had the rest of the book, but it seems to be all that's left now.
But now then you've also used photographs of works of art. Isn't this the Velázquez? Here, yeah.
It is, yes.
There's the Innocent, which I suppose is the one you've used most of all.
Well, I have, and I think most unsuccessfully, because I think it's already so remarkable that there's absolutely really nothing to do about it, but I used it out of obsession. I don't think that any of these things that I have done from other paintings actually have ever worked.
When you were in Rome, you went to see the Velázquez, the Innocent?
No, I didn't.
You never went?
No. I think another thing was probably a fear of seeing the reality of the Velázquez after my tampering with it.
And have you finished working for the day, Lloyd?
I have. The thing is, I'm accustomed to starting very early in the morning, really as soon as the light is good, because I much prefer working early. And I tend to finish sometime in the middle of the day, or 1, 2, or 3.
And even if you've been out late the night before, you've been working all morning?
I do generally get up early to work.
Mm. You always seem to come back to this part of London, don't you? To South Kensington.
In 1962, Bacon was given his first retrospective exhibition at the Tate Gallery in London and was finally recognized as one of the most important painters in Britain. On the day the exhibition opened, he received a telegram to say that Peter Lacey had died suddenly in Tangier.
How long do you ever feel that you will ever retire?
Retire? You're joking. I'll never retire. I hope to drop dead just working.
Wouldn't that be nice? But with the brush in your hand, and the last accidental slosh is as you fall.
Now, I'm not talking about anything so romantic as that. I just hope I shall go on working till I drop dead. Otherwise I could commit suicide.
Could you commit suicide?
Well, if I knew how to do it absolutely properly, perhaps I've got a doctor who'll give me the really right things. Because I've known people who tried to commit suicide, and then they haven't succeeded, and their brain is gone, and they become just vegetable blind. You've got to, when you're going to commit suicide, you've got to just do it.
No. Don't you think it's an insult to life? Or is it in fact a final accolade?
Bollocks, of course it's not an insult. What do you mean by an insult to life? What do you mean by an insult? Are you religious then?
I love life, but I think I talk pretentiously.
Well, I certainly think you do.
In 1963, Bacon met a 28-year-old South Londoner called George Dyer. He always claimed that he discovered him trying to break into the studio in Rhys Mews. Bacon said that George was the most beautiful man he had ever met, and they started living together. George quickly became his principal subject, and he painted him obsessively.
George was inspiring to him, and undoubtedly, yes. And no explaining why one person loves another person, really. It just happened. And Francis was very direct and straightforward in his feelings, I think, for people. He liked youngish men who were bright and lively, accessible and slightly outside the law in some way. He loved that, I think. It was really essential to him, I think. As we all know, if you feel very strongly sexually for some other person, they may or may not strike others as fascinating. And he found him fascinating. Francis was a big, lusty fellow, you know. He was perfectly open. Perfectly. Totally, and with great enjoyment, I think. Oh, yes. He was a randy old duck, I would say. Yes.
He was nice, George. I felt sorry for him in many ways. I think he was a strange sort of bloke. But he never had much conversation or anything.
I got on very well with George, and George was an East End lad, and I was a South East lad, and we seemed to click.
Let us say that you have a model, somebody you have already painted many times from memory.
Yes.
Have you ever had such a person sitting for you?
Yes.
And what has happened?
They inhibit me. They inhibit me because if I like them, I don't want to practice the injury that I do to them in my work before them. If I like them, I would rather practice the injury in private.
George Sober was the most delightful person. I really liked George. He was such a lovely man.
He was a gentleman, George. He was an absolute gentleman. Quiet. He was never aggressive. He was never rude or anything like that.
Do you not think that the marks you were making are both a caress and a blow, an assault?
Possibly.
But don't you think that your sitter instinctively sees this as an injury, which in a sense might be thought naive, but I'm suggesting the sitter's instinct is right.
It may be
in
right.
realising what's really going on.
What you're really saying is that what Wilde said, you kill the thing you love.
I gave so much love to this love, it was the world to me.
Est-ce que vous croyez en Dieu? Non. Pourquoi vous me demandez une question tellement bête?
Francis stayed with us in France with George. And George was charming and played football with my youngest son, Danny, and he was rather a happy, simple character. I think George felt rather lost, except as a drinking companion or bed companion, but otherwise he didn't seem to have a life of his own. So he lived through Francis. But Francis also lived through him. But I also saw, of course, Francis and George in Paris under different circumstances when they were both drinking a great deal, and it was quite rough. Rages, anger, George getting very upset, Francis being quite sadistic. George feeling inferior and resentful. But then if one was friendly with George, Francis would get upset. It would irritate him and he'd start being bitchy. You know, Francis could be the sweetest person in the world and also the cruelest person in the world. And George had no defense against words.
Bacon's paintings are usually large because he paints people near to life size. Their scale made them difficult to sell until about 5 years ago. When he shows a group of pictures in a gallery, they are the residue of a much larger number of pictures, started, often finished, and then destroyed because he was dissatisfied with them.
These are some of Bacon's latest versions of subjects he's painted again and again. Subjects which are inexhaustible because they're so simple, don't tell a particular story. They're simply confrontations with the human presence. The image has the look of someone caught in a flash. The distortion seems designed to suggest movement, and so does the way the face is smeared by paint. Or else it's as if the figure wasn't moving, but was seen by someone walking past. Bacon catches the person as if in a flash, but he gets the sense of the continuity of action, the sense that the movement is going on. Much of the distortion and smearing of the form has to do with this. And also, I think, with getting a sense of unease. His figures don't seem comfortably posed, as if they'd composed themselves to face the artist. They look as if they were caught unawares by someone coming into a room and finding them there.
Bacon had recently moved to a new gallery called Marlborough Fine Art, which was famous for looking after its artists and promoting them on the international market. His work was now being bought by major galleries, including the Guggenheim in New York, and by private collectors in America and Europe, who literally had the wall space as well as the resources. Bacon moved seemingly effortlessly from the grey of the 1950s to the glamour of the swinging 60s. Here he was feted in a BBC Arts programme, in which he allowed the director to film him in his studio, but not under any circumstances actually applying paint to the canvas.
If he wanted a bar soap at 3 o'clock in the morning, somehow it got to him. We would be sent out to pick up clothes or socks or, you know, whatever, to make sure that Francis was happy and that he could continue to just think about painting and do what he wanted to do.
It's interesting that people want to read meanings into your pictures as if they were problem pictures or narrative pictures of some sort.
But one wants to read. People like to get a meaning from everything.
But they want to get a sort of story, don't they? Or to see the pictures as a kind of comment.
They do,
on
yes.
society.
They do.
Is it ever intended to be that?
No.
I got on very well with George, so it was very good for Francis to have somebody who, you know, was able to go and have a beer with George and give him a respite from just having George sitting around while he was painting. It was a very volatile affair. You know, lots of ups and downs, which I think Francis enjoyed.
You see, George had absolutely nothing to do. I remember once when we went over, Francis had to go out somewhere, and so George was detailed off to take us out to dinner at I think Le Carrier's. You remember that restaurant that they had? And there's not much one could talk to George about, but then maybe one didn't know what to talk to him about, really, so it could be, you know, our fault as well. George has always seemed to be just dried out or being dried out or something, you know. They had a special place where he used to go, somewhere out in the country. He was very seldom sober, I think.
This letter's dated the 21st of October, 1965. And it's a letter to Francis from my brother George. And he was up in Perthshire at the time, a place called Glenhartney Lodge. And he writes, "Dear Francis, I do hope you are feeling okay and have been able to start your work, as I know you wanted to so much. I like it here very much and have had nothing to drink but tea and water. I have not taken the pills, as the cook puts wine in a lot of the food. I think as the first day I was quite sick, but I did not tell anybody and hope you will not do so. I do miss you very much indeed and long to see you. This house is very big. I have my own bathroom, which is as big as the bedroom. Today I went for a long walk and saw a lot of deer. They were very nice, and I did write you a letter yesterday, but tore it up after you phoned me. Dear Francis, I try so hard not to think of you, as I find it makes me unhappy not to be with you. I do hope you can stay away from Soho, just for me, as it always seems to lead to disaster, perhaps more me than you. Well, my dear Francis, I do hope you are happy and well. Please write soon, and thank you very much for ringing me. As Oscar Wilde would say, all my love, please believe me. Yours, George."
At the end of the decade, Bacon was invited to have a one-man exhibition at Paris's most prestigious public gallery, the Grand Palais. The only other living painter to have been honoured in this way was Picasso, and for a British artist it was an unprecedented accolade. In the course of the 60s, he had revisited his earlier form, the triptych. The paintings were monumental in scale, but often domestic in subject. They are mainly of figures in rooms, and their most frequent subject is George Dyer, whom Bacon painted more often than anybody but himself.
I always think of myself not so much as a painter, but as a medium for accident and chance.
But what is it you see?
I'm a kind of... what do I see?
What is it you see? What is it you visualize?
I see extraordinarily beautiful paintings. I can daydream for hours and pictures fall in just like slides. But it doesn't mean that the picture that I finally end up with has anything to do with the painting that has dropped into my mind. because what I see is a marvelous painting, but how are you going to make it?
The Paris exhibition opened in October 1971 and contained over 100 paintings.
I was in Paris for the Grand Palais show. I went over with Francis George and Miss Beston. And we stayed in a little hotel that Francis knew on Saint-Pierre. George was normally, you know, doing his own thing during the day and then meet up in the evenings. George came back one evening quite drunk and brought an Algerian back with him, an Algerian boy. And apparently Francis said that this boy's feet were of some appalling stench. And he said that he wasn't going to stay in the room, and he came down to me and asked if he could stay in my room. I had 2 beds, so I said, yeah, sure. And then the next morning, when we got up, he said, would you just go and see if that boy's gone, and I can go back and do my ablutions. So I did, and on the way up, I met Miss Beston, who was coming down for breakfast, and she came with me. And George was on the toilet, dead.
Francis was an habitually bad sleeper, and the only thing that helped him was a drug called Churnal. Now, these were barbiturates, and they were pretty powerful barbiturates. And he'd come and said to me, I need some Churnal. I've got to, when I get to France, I'll need to sleep. And I think those are the ones that were taken by George. George never had sleeping pills, because he was a patient of mine, and I never gave him sleeping pills. We know he took the Churnal because the empty bottle was by his side, next to the toilet.
I came over for the Paris exhibition. But then, of course, you know, George had died that morning, the morning of the opening of the exhibition. I just heard that he'd been out, he'd met up with some Arabs, and I think maybe he'd had drugs. And, you know, some drink as well. So it may not have been intentional. It was amazing because, you know, he had exactly the same before the opening of the Tate Gallery, because he'd got a message from Morocco, wasn't it, that Peter Lacy had died. I think he really was very, very fond of him. But he also, of course, was a drunk. In a way, he killed himself, didn't he? You see, and I think all those people are very, very, a little bit unstable, don't you think so? I don't know. Not that I think Francis was. I really don't think he was. He was not. I'm quite sure of that. He was very, very collected.
You wouldn't have known anything had happened. Francis carried on as if nothing had happened at all. It didn't stop him turning up at the exhibition or joining us all afterwards, after the opening. And he was great at the party, but he had a bit to drink.
Bacon got in touch with my mother, and he arranged for George's body to be brought back. It was brought back in a lead-lined coffin, And he arranged all that, and then when his body was brought back, we had the funeral, and he's buried at the City of London Cemetery in Ilford with my mum and dad and my other two brothers. Francis came in a limousine, but he stood quite a way off from the actual family. He stood well in the background, but he was there, yeah. I think he probably knew that there'd be a few questions asked. That's my opinion anyway. But my brother knew he was there, my eldest brother Ron, and he got very uptight about it. He thought that the life that he'd been leading and the life that he had contributed to his death. And it did. And he wanted to confront Francis over this at his funeral. But my mother said, leave it, let it go. 37. Yes, he was 37. Quite a young man, really. Waste of life.
You said that the people have died. You don't want to go on painting portraits of them once they're dead.
It seems a bit mad to, painting portraits of dead people. After all, one knows that if they hadn't been, what's it called, incinerated, that they've rotted away, that their flesh has rotted away. And once they're dead, you have your memory of them, but you haven't got them.
When you'd accepted the idea of death,
what?
How did that influence what happened next in your life?
I don't know. It made a great deal of difference beyond knowing that here you are, brushed off like flies from the wall.
This is just a little rooftop shot at 80 Narrow Street. We like the fact that this is the stretch of the river where Marlowe narrated Heart of Darkness. And the evolutionary realities were very important to him. The disappearance of the big game and the whole atmosphere of the Pleistocene, and his sister was on the Limpopo.
Peter Beard was invited by Bacon to visit a new studio he had bought in Narrow Street, Limehouse, on the River Thames. Beard was a pioneering photographer whose pictures of the decimation of the African elephant had made him a fashionable 70s figure. The style and the subject of his photographs appealed particularly to Bacon.
He didn't like people around when he was working. He obviously did weird things, like he accidentally rub against the thing, or his shoulder, blowing dust, or you know, trying to get a thing that doesn't work completely different. It's probably like an animal in a cage, you know, trying to get into the reality of his isolation and savagery and roots and dismal future. I mean, he knew what he was doing was in a pretty important direction, and he was tough, self-contained. A huge world, self-originated. He did feel that vultures could sense the blood, they could smell the blood. The elephant, the rhino, the ability to live millions of years, we're just a fraction. Bacon saw the miracle of evolutionary diversity and the preposterous human impact. I think that's what it comes down to. Very haunting. Where we've come from, what are we, and where we're going.
I like painting good-looking people because I like their bone structure. And this man who works in Kenya has turned up. He is a very good subject. I loathe my own face, but I go on painting it only because I hadn't got the other people to do.
How would you like that?
I got a feeling inside of me. It's kind of strange, like a stormy sea. I don't know why, I don't know why. I guess these things have gotta be. I got a new rose, I got it good. Yes, I knew that I always would. I can't stop to mess around. I got a brand new rose in town. See the sun it shines. Don't get too close or it'll burn your eyes. Don't you run away that way. You can come back another day. I got a new rose, I got it good. Yes, I knew that I always would. I can't stop to mess around. I got a brand new...
I know John very well. I very much like his looks, and it's always nicer to do portraits of people whose looks you really like.
John Edwards met Bacon in the mid-1970s, and he quickly became his constant companion. Bacon always said that his relationship with John was a paternal one. He bought him a flat around the corner from Rhys Mews and provided him with everything that he desired. They saw each other on a daily basis, and for many years they were inseparable.
What does anybody like? Anybody like anything?
Well, when I first met Francis, I thought it was like a little bit like sort of lamb dressed like mutton a little bit. So he had these tight corduroy trousers. And he had quite a good arse for his age. Yeah, and I thought I said to myself, he looks quite cool. And he used to wear this tight gold bangle around his neck, which, if I used to wear any gold, he used to tell me to take it off. I had my ear pierced in '85. Just before the big show in the Tate Gallery. And it was one of those ones where you do it by machine. You know, you click it on and you can't take it off then. I said, I've all friends, I said, I just can't take it off. You know, it's going to have to stay for 2 weeks. He said, no, I'll take it off. And he just wrenched it off with one hand. And my ears started bleeding. That's what he was like. But he would phone me up, sort of 9 o'clock. And then I'd get ready for 10 o'clock. Just had his dressing gown or whatever. And he'd cook the breakfast. And I would only have the white of the yolk of the egg, the yellow part, and dip my bread in it. And when I finished the breakfast, then he would eat the white part of the egg.
I was introduced to John by Robert Fraser, who was as enamoured of John as Francis himself was. And John had an extraordinary and odd role in the art world. He knew nothing about art. He didn't understand it at all. His continuous and serial question to Francis was, why the fuck do you make me look like a monkey in all your paintings? And Francis always used to laugh at the question, but never answered it. He couldn't really hold a conversation, John, about many things outside of his immediate circle of experience, which was Soho and the East End of London. John had an extraordinary innocence about him, and it was the kind of innocence that was redolent with strength. It was not the innocence of a pussy who could be pushed around. He was a strong man, and he took no shit from Francis. If Francis was in one of his bitchy moods and was poking his knife into John, he got it right back. And John would just say, if that's the mood you're in, I'm off.
A very good cook. Excellent cook. I mean, he could have been a cook. No, Francis wouldn't even have a takeaway. Be all his own cooking. If we was out together and he was with someone, though I call Posh, and having a conversation about art or something like that, within 5 minutes, Francis would always stop the conversation and go on saying different to bring me in the conversation. They would always tell him that I was a barman in the East End of London. So then they're forced to talk about bar work or what sort of thing I used to do in the East End of London. Which was very nice rather than listening about art all the time. Francis, the good thing about with me and Francis was if we was out together and people wanted to talk about art to him, it was a good way of him releasing himself and let's talk about something different. I'm with John now.
Vegetables, I know. Well, I do like
Or
vegetables.
even restaurants. I even hate going to restaurants to eat.
Do you? I thought you rather enjoyed it.
No, because I like the food I eat.
Yes, but then when you can... for instance, you tell me how much you like the food in California when you only ate, hamburgers.
I never heard Francis say a bad word about John. He said to me, you see, Paul, my estate is absolutely simple. It's going to be very quick, very easy. I've left everything to John. Everything. I think of John like a son. He's a son to me, really. But John had a long-term boyfriend, Philip Mordew, and eventually John went off with Philip, originally to America, and then they went to Thailand.
I wish you could have an old-fashioned corkscrew. Now they've made everything so new. It used to be much simpler when you just put the corkscrew in and pulled out the cork. Then now that you have to turn two things to get the cork out.
When you were running that pub, John, had people sort of started drinking wine in London the way they do now?
No, they should drink vinegar.
I don't believe in love, really. I mean, love is marvellous if it happens.
And not only sexual love, I mean love of life, love of friends, love of...
Well, I would have said the sexual obsession was the strongest one. After that, what would
I
you
find it
say?
very overrated, but I've never experienced it as much as you have, Francis.
Oh, really? Well, I think there's only sexual obsession. What is love? Ask me, what is love?
Love is the absolute, pure exhilaration and ecstasy of being alive, of being in the most extraordinary world in which one can make contact with strangers.
I wouldn't put it in those very grandiose terms at all. I would have thought...
Don't puncture me too much.
I would have thought love was just insofar as you can be decent from one person to another.
Well.
After all, God knows that's rare enough.
We've established what love is. How do we establish what sex is?
Well, sex is what it is, isn't it? Sex is what it is.
Well, surely
It's a moment. Sex is what it is. It's a moment of ecstasy. If you like the person, or if you don't even like them. But it's it's really the moment of coming, isn't it? Of coming off. That's what its pleasure is, isn't it? Cheerio.
Cheerio, Francis.
Francis had no sentimentality in him, no nostalgia, and that was frankly thrilling. Because I met him, don't forget, at the time of punk rock. And that was a reaction against mediocrity. It was a generation saying, we're fed up with commercial median crap. We want something real again. Give us the guts, give us the blood, give us the spunk. We want something real. And to my great shock and surprise, in the mid-1970s, this old guy was the most violently full-on punk that I knew. And that was thrilling.
I don't try to paint despair, but the thing about life is, after the age of about 30, what is there, in a sense, fundamentally, but death? That's not looking towards despair, by the way, but it's just a realization that there is the grave coming up closer and closer, closer and closer, closer.
He was talking about going to Spain because it was so cold. I kind of knew I wouldn't see him again. It was just that kind of feeling. And you know, he was actually, I think, quite bored with life in many ways by then. Well, that's a stupid thing to say because I'm sure he wasn't, but it was just, his friends had gone, you know. There were really very few. Who was left? There was Jose. But then Jose was years younger than him, and there was John. But I don't know where John was. You see, John had a boyfriend of his own, Philip. So I think Francis was feeling lonely, but he really wasn't well.
Bacon's last lover was a wealthy young Spaniard, more than 40 years his junior, who was fluent in several languages and lived between London and Spain. They began their affair in the late 1980s, and Bacon visited him several times in Madrid. In 1990, he took Bacon to the Prado to see the retrospective exhibition of his hero, the great Spanish painter Velázquez.
What about asking pleasure? That you leave an art gallery feeling physically more, actually feeling physically better.
Oh, shut up, you're old thing. That's the way you always talk. Excitement is pleasure.
I'm talking about something like the Piero della Francesca.
I say excitement is pleasure.
Oh, pleasure.
Yes. If you're excited by something, it gives you pleasure.
Yes,
well, there it is, exactly. Be satisfied because everything escapes you. Even if you're in love with somebody, everything escapes you. You would want to be nearer that person. How can you cut your flesh open and join it with the other person? It's an impossibility to do. So it is with art. It is almost like a long affair with objects and images and sensations and what you can call the passions.
In his 80s, the chronic asthma that had plagued Bacon since childhood developed into a severe respiratory condition. On his last visit to Madrid, he was admitted to a private clinic. José, meanwhile, was called away on business.
Soy religiosa sierva de María, ministra de los enfermos. Que nos dedicamos, somos enfermeras y nos dedicamos a cuidar a los enfermos en su domicilio. Entonces, y además en clínicas o en hospitales o en dispensarios, donde estén los enfermos, vamos. Y aquí fue donde vino el señor Bacon. Básicamente es la misma habitación y está igual, no se ha cambiado nada. Sabía que era un pintor, pero no sabía la trascendencia ni el tipo de pintor, porque él, como tenía tanta dificultad respiratoria, hablaba muy poco. Algún ratito que eso leía más y eso. Y comunicar, pues no, porque se estaba ahogando, no podía hablar, no tenía mucha facilidad para eso. exactamente el día de la muerte, porque fue una muerte muy súbita, fue una parada cardiorrespiratoria y eso altera siempre el ritmo de la clínica. A eso de las 9 tenía dificultad respiratoria hasta el momento que se paró, pero fue una parada brusca. Intentaron reanimarle, pero la parada fue fulminante que no hubo nada que hacer, se quedó muerto.
Turn down the honours that have been offered you?
Well, what's an honour mean to me?
Wouldn't you have liked to be Sir Francis or Lord Francis?
I certainly would not.
Why?
What?
Why?
Why? Because it's in a sense, it sort of cordons you off from existence. Comprendo? Do you think we said enough? I'm sure too much. I'm sure we said too much.